Welcome. It is my distinct honor and privilege to open this evening's event, Free the Cuban Five. This is an event about confinement of people, individuals. Antonio Guerrero, Fernando Gonzalez, Rene Gonzalez, Gerardo Hernandez, Ramon Labanino, but also the confinement of a certain type of politics. Many of us here today are already familiar with the story of the five. Others of us are not intimately familiar with the case. Whether or not you come to this event with prior knowledge, it is our hope today that all will learn not only about the five as people, but about the political legal structure that acts against them, the family and communities they have been separated from, and the struggle that continues today. That struggle we are all a part of. Having passed over the formalities, I would like to take a moment to thank each and every one for being present. Presence is sometimes the most radical act we can have. It is a necessary precondition to the fight that we carry on. My name is Randolph Carr. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate, standing here, fully present as a representative of the Black Students Organization and Students Against Mass Incarceration. For me, the story of the five is one that is, unfortunately, similar to the story of the many unseen and forgotten that sit, waiting and waiting, behind the walls of America's dungeons. Similar to the five, people are swept into the system of incarceration by whatever means and forced to bow down to the weight of that machine. The five have been swept into that system, and to this day remain unbowed. It then slowly attempts to grind down on the individual, locking them in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. Still, they remain unbowed. We can learn from the five a lesson for our own struggle of how to stand tall and never bow. How do we stand up, I think, is the first question we must ask ourselves. How do we rise from underneath the legacies of colonialism? How do we stand side by side with those who live under the American criminal justice system? What do we have to learn about how to live free from those forced to live in cages because of their politics? These questions, I hope, will be answered tonight along with the many other questions on our minds. A lot has gone into making this event what it is. It's been challenging in many ways to secure a space and promote for this event. The empty seats you see are people turned around or denied access. Regardless, the event will go on. It's been a pleasure collaborating across student groups and community organizations. I would like to thank all of the groups involved for bringing this together, and again, thanking you for allowing me to stand. Before I go, I would like to introduce one of the important figures in helping bring this event together, Ike Nahum, member of July 26 Coalition, to present our hosts and speakers. Thank you, and all power to the people.
My name is Ike Nahum. I'm an Amtrak locomotive engineer and a member of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. And I would ask the students here to please excuse the sexist holdovers of our names. There are today actually numerous female engineers, and they need to change the name of our union. But anyway, which is the division of the Teamsters Union. I am representing the July 26 Coalition, which is a coalition of dozens of organizations and activists in the New York, New Jersey region working to end Washington's economic and political war against the island of Cuba and to free the Cuban Five. Some of you tonight are familiar with the case of the Cuban Five. many others just becoming familiar with their reality, and are going to hear of a profound, even stunning case of injustice. You are likely to be shocked and angered by the pure vindictiveness displayed and the crude political manipulations promoted by the U.S. government, both Democratic and Republican White Houses and Justice Departments, and the legal authorities up and down the line. But I think you will also be stirred and inspired by the conduct, the heroism and courage, and the moral high ground in the example and behavior of these 5 men, these Cuban patriots and revolutionaries. 3 of the Cuban 5, Fernando, Gerardo, and Rene, volunteered and fought in southern Africa in the late 1980s and contributed as part of Cuba's foreign policy of international solidarity, of defending Angolan independence, winning independence for Namibia, and, in the words of Nelson Mandela, being a decisive factor in the final military and political unraveling and defeat of apartheid South Africa. Tonight you are going to hear how 5 young men volunteered to infiltrate and monitor right-wing paramilitary Cuban-American organizations with long-standing histories of violence, assassination, economic sabotage, and terrorism against the sovereign nation of Cuba, with the tolerance and often the direct collaboration of the U.S. authorities. Over 3,000 Cubans have died in such activity since the 1959 triumph of the Cuban Revolution. It is my pleasure now to introduce and turn over the rest of the evening to our co-hosts and MCs. The first is attorney Michael Warren, truly one of the real heroes of New York City. Michael is in the trenches and bowels of the legal system every day, fighting for the rights and freedoms for the oppressed and exploited communities of New York City. Among the many important cases Michael has been involved in was as the appeals attorney in the infamous case of the Central Park Five. You should all see the excellent documentary, The Central Park Five, where Michael is featured. Second is our sister Nancy Cabrero. Nancy is a prominent New York City educator and school principal. She has been the long-standing president of Casa de las Americas, which is a group of Cuban Americans who defend the Cuban Revolution. Casa's origins began before the revolution here in New York City, where they organized against the Batista dictatorship and toured a young Fidel Castro here and throughout the East Coast.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to be here.
Good evening. It's my pleasure as well. The following video clip that you're about to see was recorded on September the 12th of 2007. And though the video was addressed to the students and faculty and staff of Howard University, we believe it sends a strong message. It's a message of solidarity to the Cuban Five by Danny Glover, film director and political activist.
These 5 Cuban citizens acted in the self-defense of their nation and their families. They had to act because the United States government, in violation of its own laws and in contravention of its own call to prevent and stamp out terrorist activity, failed to act. The U.S. government failed to prevent murderous terrorist attacks being repeatedly launched from within the U.S. for many decades against the sovereign nation of Cuba. These 5 Cuban citizens have been unjustly imprisoned and condemned to unusually harsh and cruel punishment for exercising their moral obligation to self-defense, a right agreed upon by all nations. Rogue acts of violence against the Cuban people by covert U.S.-based terrorists and supported by the inaction and irresponsibility of our government demands critical intervention by the American people. Across the ideological and political spectrum, people who honestly stand against terrorism must speak out against these terrorist acts that operate outside of U.S. and international law. They must speak out in defense of the Cuban Five. I invite all of you to join in and to organize fellow students, faculties, administrators, family, and friends to bring to life the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," and call on our government to implement our nation's moral and legal obligations to justice and international law.
Imani Brown from the Columbia University Caribbean Students Association was most instrumental at ensuring that this important event take place for Columbia students and then the external community. Hers was the clear and resounding voice that closely communicated the mission of this prestigious institution, which is to advance knowledge and learning at its highest level to its immediate and global community. We are grateful to Columbia University for sustaining its legacy of activism and for acknowledging the contribution that students like Imani Brown are making to sustain the vision and mission of this school. Please welcome Imani Brown.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Imani Brown, and I'm the Intercampus Liaison of the Caribbean Students Association. This is an event that we were really hoping would increase the visibility and increase the action around the gross human rights violations that have been enacted on the Cuban Five. We have run into some difficulties along the way as events like this that are centered around things that others deem to be controversial often are. However, that's not going to stop us when it comes to making our voices heard about this important topic. Why do we, as the Caribbean Students Association, stand in solidarity with the Cuban Five and what they stand for? As an integral member of the Caribbean community, Cuba's social, cultural, and economic history has had deeply lasting effects on the rest of the region and has provided an almost unparalleled model for alternative modes of development in the region. In the history of independence struggles and movements to end the reign of colonialism and neocolonialism worldwide, Cuba has not hesitated to lend its support and strategic partnership to what it has seen as its Caribbean and African family. Cuba has given new meaning to ideals of solidarity, unity, and support within its community. At the same time, our support of the Cuban Five is not solely based on what Cuba has done for or has meant to the Caribbean. The Cuban Five had what is now widely agreed an unfair trial based on insufficient evidence and received sentences which can only be described as cruel and unusual by virtue of the length of these sentences, the refusal to allow them contact with their wives and families, and their treatment in the separate maximum security prisons in which they remain to present day. Cuba's history of resistance against American neocolonial systems of power have reserved them a place of infamy in the nation's narrative. This is an important thing to note for a number of reasons. Not only has resistance to American neocolonial systems of power influenced the imprisonment of the Cuban Five, but it is the driving force of the prison industrial complex which has enacted violence on millions of brown and black bodies in the US and throughout the world. So this is not solely a Cuban problem. Nor is it solely a Caribbean problem. It is indicative of a wider systemic problem. The arbitrary imprisonment of individuals as a solution to the socio-political and economic problems of a society does not sound characteristic of a nation that claims freedom and liberty as the very building blocks of its foundations. Yet it is, and yet it necessarily must be, to enact the very discriminatory and hostile aggression that in the same breath it insists that it abhors. As Caribbean students, we come to this institution with an awareness that our region's legacy of colonialism often finds insidious ways of inserting itself into our current narrative. What was once a resistance to explicit independence by former colonizers is now the call for neoliberalism and the development of the so-called Third World on the terms of the world's hegemonic powers for their profit. What was once the unchecked plundering of lands that belonged to others is now deemed nation building or the business of ensuring national security. And what was once slavery is now termed the prison industrial complex that allows for and encourages the arbitrary detention of those it views as its opposition. This is why we stand in solidarity with the Cuban Five. Because as the forces of colonialism and imperialism reimagine themselves, we must reimagine the forms of resistance that we enact in order to ensure our own liberty and freedom. For these reasons and more, we support the call for freedom of the Cuban Five and for a reevaluation of the wider societal systems in place that affect us and our communities in the living of our day-to-day lives.
Our next speaker is the prominent human rights attorney Michael Warren, known for handling cases of police brutality, including those of Michael Stewart, Yvonne Smallwood, Tupac Shakur, and the 5 young Black and Latino teenagers falsely convicted of raping a white bank executive, a documentary of which has recently appeared in movie theaters called The Central Park Five. He served as international legal spokesperson for Mumia Abu Jamal and was on the prosecution team in Atlanta, Georgia, for the capital murder case of Jamil Ali Amin, better known as H. Rap Brown. Participated against the Bush administration and the U.S. government in Tokyo, Japan in 2003, for the Bush administration's illegal bombing and use of depleted uranium weapons in Afghanistan.
It's an honor for me to be here to talk to you about the case of the Cuban Five. A lot of people have asked the question, who are the Cuban Five? Why were they arrested? What did they do? And for people who don't have any information about the case, these are legitimate questions. But I think that in order to understand the case of the Cuban Five and understand the degradation of the wrong that was committed against the Cuban Five, one has to be aware and to know the history of how this unfortunate situation evolved. And I think first we have to look at what happened after the revolution. You had a lot of landowners who were petty bourgeois, who worked in essence for the American government. And Americans came in and out of Cuba at will, and in effect ran Cuba at that time, and the masses suffered at the hands of the American government and the petty bourgeois. Those individuals that were forced out of Cuba after the revolution went to Miami with hardened attitudes against Cuba and against Fidel and against all of those that were responsible in their minds for what happened to them and the loss of their properties under the capitalist system that they had at that time. So what happened as a result of that? Well, as a result of that, you had a group of different groups of terrorists, that's what I call them, that were formed in Miami with hardened attitudes. And those hardened attitudes served as a basis for the actions that they engaged in against an independent Cuba. And those actions involved terrorist activities, such as bombings. There were a number of bombings, thousands of bombings, between the 60s and 70s, and to some extent the 80s. And a number of these bombings were as a result of these activities of these organizations in Miami that were firmly supported by the U.S. government. One of the organizations out of Miami, which is well known, is an organization called Brothers to the Rescue. And Brothers to the Rescue was a group of terrorists who used to fly into Cuban airspace, not international waters, Cuban airspace, and drop leaflets, to people who lived in Cuba, urging them to rise up against the government in Cuba. Their attempt was to destabilize Cuba. Their attempt also was to destabilize Cuba from the standpoint of destroying the tourist trade that the new government had begun to try to develop and get off the ground. One of the individuals who was a part of this terrorist network was a man by the name of Orlando Bosch. And Orlando Bosch was a Miami Cuban in exile, hardened attitude, a criminal, a terrorist, who was responsible for the 1976 bombing of a Cubana Airlines plane in which 73 civilians were killed, including the entire Cuban Olympic fencing team. And Mr. Bosch, or Orlando, was once considered an undesirable alien by the U.S. government and by the U.S. Immigration Service, but notwithstanding that, he was granted residential status, or resident status. Guess who? By whom? By George Bush Sr. And as a result of being granted resident status, he was allowed to freely walk around with absolute impunity. Another terrorist is a man by the name of Luis Posada Carriles. And Luis Posada Carriles was the head of a military organization that planned to assassinate Fidel in Venezuela. He has never been prosecuted for that. He has received the shelter of the United States government and is enjoying the same semblance of freedom that Orlando Bosch is. In many bombings in Havana that took place, one of the most atrocious bombings was a bombing of the Havana Hotel, in which an Italian tourist was killed and hundreds of individuals who were residing at the hotel at that time were actually seriously injured. Not a squeak from the United States government, who supported the exile activity that resulted in these bombings. Now, as a result of this, and it's important that you understand that this type of activities have been going on for a long period of time. And as a result of these activities, the Cuban people and the Cuban government said we have to enact measures to try to protect ourselves. In the case of the flights by the brothers to the rescue who flew into Cuban airspace, 2 of those planes were shot down. That hardened the attitudes of those in Miami. The necessity of bringing or doing something about this problem brought about an engagement by 5 individuals whom I have extreme pride and respect for. And that is Gerardo, Antonio Guerrero, Ramon Labranino, Fernando Gonzalez, and Rene Gonzalez. And one of the important things that you have to understand is that they put their lives on the line. Their families were sacrificed, but they put their lives on the line to defend their country. And as a result, 2 of them, who were actually U.S. citizens living in Miami, and 3 others engaged in activities that did not constitute espionage. What they were engaged in is a monitoring process of those Miami-based terrorist organizations that I just described, and others like Alpha 66, who were responsible for these acts of atrocities against the Cuban government and the Cuban people. And this monitoring process occurred over a period of a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. And they were able to infiltrate some of those organizations and take down very valuable information and report it back to Cuba. And this was purely for the purposes of defending Cuba. This is not acts of espionage against the U.S. government, but it was simply to keep tabs on those individuals who were responsible for committing these acts of atrocities against the Cuban people. So yes, they were agents of the Cuban government, but no, they were not engaged in acts of espionage against the U.S. government or the U.S. people. After approximately 3 years, actually in June of 1998, June 17th of 1998, there was a historic meeting between high-level law enforcement individuals in Cuba and against high-level law enforcement individuals, primarily from the FBI in this country. That meeting took place in Havana. And at that meeting, the law enforcement agencies from Cuba handed over documents to the FBI, documents which revealed not only what these terrorist organizations had done, but how their methodology was manifested. And less than 3 or 4 or 5 months approximately after that meeting, after these FBI agents went back to America, Antonio Guerrero, Gerardo Hernandez, Rene Gonzalez, Fernando Gonzalez, and Ramon Labanino were arrested. And they were arrested for approximately 26 counts. Now, most of those counts were rather minor crimes, like fake identities. Naturally, they would have fake identities, even though Antonio used his own identity, and another one of them used his own identity, but the others had fake identities because they were infiltrating terrorist organizations. So naturally, if they used their actual identities or let them know who they were, then that would constitute a danger to their objectives. As a result, they were arrested and they were charged with a number of crimes, mostly minor, as I said, 26 in total. But the most serious were counts of espionage and counts of murder. The murder counts primarily applied to Gerardo Hernandez as a result of the bombing or the shooting down of the 2 planes that were engineered by Brothers to the Rescue. But what the prosecution did, because they knew that they would have a difficult time trying to prove or establish these charges beyond a reasonable doubt individually, they ended up charging them with conspiracy counts. Because the easiest thing for a prosecutor to do is to level conspiracy charges. Because if you level conspiracy charges, you don't have the highest burden of having to demonstrate proof beyond a reasonable doubt and facts that would support proving that the individual acts were committed. All they had to do is to prove that they engaged in a conspiracy. So initially, when the case, after they were arrested, the 5 were pretrial. They were remanded without bail, no bail whatsoever, for 33 months. And the first 17 months of that total 33 months, they spent in solitary confinement. And the reason the U.S. government does that is to try to break your spirit. They try to break you down so that they can control you like a ventriloquist, to satisfy their palates and their appetites and their objectives. But what they didn't know is that these 5 individuals were revolutionaries. And they were committed to the ideals of the Cuban Revolution, and they were committed to the Cuban people, and they were committed to the Cuban government. That's why they were over here in the first place, engaging in the work that they were engaged in. And I might add that that a number of what they were charged with is being in possession of classified documents. None of these documents were classified. The documents they were all public documents. They were documents that the FBI, the US government knew were public documents, and they didn't become classified until after the arrest of these individuals, in which the FBI stamped classified on public documents. And public documents, truly public documents, could not serve as a legal basis for charging anyone with espionage. And that's why those documents were stamped as being classified after the fact. When the trial finally started, they were faced with a demographic problem. And the demographic problem was that out of the total, at that time, total population of Miami, of something like 1.5 million people, 700,000 of those were Miami Cubans. Now, imagine yourself under those circumstances being tried by a jury who would be populated substantially by Miami Cubans who had hardened attitudes that obviously would have an impact on your ability to obtain a fair trial under the Sixth Amendment. So one of the crucial issues at trial, and there were a number of different issues, but the principal issue in the trial was the threshold issue of the venue, the change of venue. And when you make a change of venue application or motion, that has to be preceded. You can't make that right away. That has to be preceded by a study, by experts of the population in the area that might be considered to be prospective jurors. And so the defense attorneys requested at the time that they be given adequate funds for purposes of conducting these surveys, racial attitudes of people who lived in the community, and in-depth analysis, so that that in-depth analysis could be incorporated into a comprehensive report that would hopefully ultimately serve as a basis for a judge saying, yes, there should be a change of venue. But they would not allow proper funding by the trial judge for a proper comprehensive report. So they had these experts that were hired by the defense had to work with whatever they had. And as a result, the report that they submitted, it was not unexpected that the judge would say, but certainly hypocritical, that the judge would say that the report was not sufficient enough to serve as a basis for changing the venue. And of course, the case was tried. The case was tried over a number of months. And during the trial, and even before the trial, and this is something that was discovered later on, there were journalists in the area that worked for major newspaper outlets that were castigating all type of poison against the five. They couldn't have possibly have gotten a fair trial. Not a chance whatsoever. It was like, in the metaphorical sense, it was like being shot with a double-barrel shotgun. In one barrel, you had a lethal bullet of shotgun shots that constituted the venue issue. It was just as lethal as the propaganda that was levied against them that was in the other barrel of that shotgun. So they didn't have a chance. They didn't have a snowball's chance in hell in a trial in Miami. And it's not unusual because we understand what goes on in the courts in this country, especially if you are a political prisoner. If you are a political prisoner, all bets are off, if there's any semblance of legality at all for those who are normally charged, what there very little is. The funding of two principal organizations resulted in the propaganda that was put into the newspapers in which journalists were paid by these organizations. One of these organizations, which was the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, which had operated over the years and had gotten over the years $500 million from the United States government. During the trial, at the time of the trial, they had an annual budget of $35 million. They were the ones that received the money for the U.S. government, along with the board of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, another straw operation, Cuban American operation, Miami Cuban operation, that ultimately funneled the money to these journalists to write these scandalous articles. That is actually a violation of federal law, what this government did by disseminating monies to these organizations so that they could affect domestic policy. It's a violation of Section 22 USC, United States Code, Title USC's United States Code, Section 1461. And it prohibits the U.S. government from funding activities to influence and propagandize domestic public opinion. So naturally, after all this, the five were convicted. But being fighters, they fought on through their attorneys. And there was an appeal made to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta, which is considered to be a rather conservative circuit. But after hearing the arguments, the three-judge panel issued a 94-page decision. That was the most impressive decision, one of the most impressive decisions I have ever read. And what was screaming out in that decision was their disdain, and you could feel their disdain when you read the decision, disdain for the trial judge's denial of a change of venue. In fact, they said they didn't have a chance. They said what I just said in different words, of course, that they didn't have a snowball's chance in hell. And they were personally offended. And as you read the decision, you could feel their personal offense. What happened after that? The government naturally filed a motion, made an application for re-argument before the entire bench, all of the judges in the Second Circuit. They called that an en banc application. And that was made as a result of a political instigation. In other words, there was political interference, a political directive that motion should be made for re-argument before the entire bench. Because I'm sure that the U.S. government was surprised as to the three-judge unanimous decision reversing the trial court convictions and sending the case back for a new trial. And as a result of that three-judge panel decision, that was reversed. And after that was reversed, there was a further application to the U.S. Supreme Court, and naturally that was under the Obama administration, and that was a recent application not long ago, and the U.S. Supreme Court, under the orders of Obama, I would think, since it was his solicitor, defended, and the Supreme Court denied certiorari, or denied review of the 11th Circuit Court decision. 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 11th Now, just very briefly, what happened after that is that the three-judge panel, after the en banc decision, the three-judge panel, that the case was sent back to another panel, they upheld the convictions. But three of the five, Antonio Guerrero, Ramon Labanino, and Fernando's sentences, or their cases were sent back for resentencing. And Antonio, who had initially been given life, his sentence was reduced on December the 8th of 2009 to 22 years. Ramon Labanino, who originally had been given life, his sentence was reduced to 30 years on the same date. And Fernando Gonzalez, who had originally been given 19 years, his sentence was reduced to 18 years. However, Geraldo Hernandez, who got 2 consecutive life sentences, and his attorney is sitting right here, Martin Garbus, those sentences are still over his head. Rene Gonzalez, who originally got 15 years, did 13 years, was released not long ago, about a year ago, I guess, give or take. And one of the things that's draconian about his release is that after he was released, they put him on 3 years probation, precluding him from traveling anywhere outside the city of Miami, even though he was allowed a 2-week visit to Cuba not long ago. So, in closing, I would say that as a lawyer, and I'm sure that Marty can elaborate on this as well, as a lawyer for a number of years, it's important to make the best legal arguments that you possibly can. And it's certainly best to be as prepared as you possibly can in these courts of law. But the real defining basis for determining ultimate victory is always the power and the push of the people. The people are the fuel. The people are the fuel of the legal machinery, and we cannot let this case go by the wayside. We have to stay with these brothers. For those of you who are new to this case, pass the word. Justice for the Cuban Five and justice for all political prisoners. Thank you. Martin Garbus is an expert at every level of civil and criminal trial and litigation. He has appeared before the United States Supreme Court in leading First Amendment cases, and his cases have established precedents here and in other courts throughout the country. His list of clients include Nelson Mandela, Michael Bloomberg, Lenny Bruce, Al Pacino, Václav Havel, to name just a few. He is also the lead attorney for the case of the Cuban Five. Please welcome Martin Garbus, who will give us a legal update on the case and who will talk about habeas corpus.
There are 2 separate legal structures that you should be familiar with. One is what the defendants and the defense lawyers knew as the trial was going on. And then a separate structure is what was going on during the trial that the defense lawyers knew nothing about and that the defendants knew nothing about, and fundamentally did not form any part of the appeal. This new information was presented to the court for the first time back in 2010, and we submitted our final papers in January, and the judge, under the law, has an obligation to start to deal with the motion with these applications, habeas corpus applications, within 90 days. So that's where we are right now. These documents you can find on the website, the www.freethefive.org, all the legal documents that we filed, and they are of some complexity. They result from an enormous amount of an investigation since the year 2010 as to what happened outside the purview of the court, outside the purview of the appellate courts, and unfortunately, outside the awareness, by and large, of the defense lawyers. With respect to the case that was in court that Michael has been talking about, I just want to highlight a few things to you. The shoot-down is February 1996. The first arrests in the case come more than 2 years later, in September 1998. The prosecution is started under Clinton, it ends under Bush, and it deals with the politics of who's going to get Miami during the election of the year 2000. At the time of the shoot-down, the American government, the FBI, the CIA, knew everything they had to know about the shoot-down. These defendants were known as Michael has indicated. There was a dialogue going on between the FBI and the Cuban government and these particular defendants. So these defendants were known to be living in the Miami area. For 2.5 years, the American government never sought to charge them, never sought to arrest them, never sought to ever claim that they had anything to do with these particular murders. What happened at the end of the century was the Elian Gonzalez case, where fundamentally the right-wing Cubans suffered a defeat and the young boy was returned to Cuba. The cry for blood, which went through the Miami community to somehow get what they needed, they felt, and the political forces, Clinton and Bush, to get what they needed to satisfy that community and get that vote, ultimately results in this indictment and conviction. I've been involved in cases for many, many decades, many, many cases before the Supreme Court. I've taught at law schools. You'll never see a case like this. You will never see a case that was tried in this kind of atmosphere, and you will never see a case with this kind of result. Having said that, what was going on outside the courtroom was far, far more invidious than was going inside the courtroom. In February of 1996, at the time of the shoot-down, there was something called Radio Marti. Radio Marti operated out of Washington, D.C. It moved in February of 1996 to Miami. And the budget for Radio Marti, Radio TV Marti, was about $40 million. You have in Miami money spilling all over the place, both from governmental entities, from entities like the National Endowment for Democracy, from various CIA charitable fronts. You will find involved in this case, outside the purview of anybody's knowledge, former CIA people, Bay of Pigs people, people who are involved with Operation Mongoose, and other people who were periodically and regularly going into Cuba and attacking the Cuban people with boats, guns, and other kinds of weapons, and some of the bombings that we have seen with respect to tourists. So what happens then in February of 1996 is this vast amount of money moves down to to Miami. The government recognizes there have been endless Senate investigation committees of Radio Marti, that in Washington they can't control the flow of money, they can't see where the money is going. So the way they deal with it is they send the operation down to Miami, and basically the central government, Washington, washes its hands of it. And if you go, there are hearings and records, and you can go before all that, and you'll see there was no longer any control of the monies, and nobody knows where the money went. We find, and this is the investigation over the last year and a half, we find where a lot of those monies went. A lot of those monies went to deal with this particular trial. This was a critical issue. The Cold War was still being fought in the Miami Straits, and it was a significant issue to get a conviction of these particular people. And what the American government did was they got vast sums of money, tens of millions of dollars, over prolonged periods of time, both to influence the community to get indictments against these particular defendants, and then to create a feeling of hostility and anxiety and fury on the part of the jurors, and fear on the part of the jurors, that if they didn't come back and convict these particular people, that they themselves would suffer recriminations. The judge at some level tried to deal with some of these issues. For example, and what I'm now going to tell you is about some papers we just filed 3 months ago, something we just found out. The judge had indicated that in order to protect the jurors' names should not be known to the media, the jurors' faces should not be known to the media, so that the jurors would not feel any particular pressure in their community and would not feel that they would lose their job or that something would happen to them in this extraordinary volatile atmosphere. The papers we filed in January came up with the following information: that people on the payrolls of various television stations, CBS, Channel 23 down there, Univision, Spanish-American stations, as well as local stations, were getting monies from the American government. They were getting monies from the American government, and there were shows being shown on TV which came out under the names of the particular people, the commentators who were doing the talking. The public did not know that those monies were government monies espousing a particular view. But beyond that, which is pernicious and violates the law, what the TV cameras did is, as the jury started their deliberations, it was a 5-day deliberations, the TV cameras went in, captured the jurors walking out of the courtroom, printed the names of the jurors, so that for the 5-day period that the jury was sitting on the case, this is a 7-month trial, and we'll talk about other things also, but for that 5-day period, every single night, on multiple TV stations, you saw the jurors walking in and walking out of the courtroom. We only learned recently, during the course of this recent investigation, that the people who were doing that, as I said, were being paid by government monies. Also, what the TV and cameraman people did is they followed the jurors out to their cars, and you could see the license plate numbers of the jurors on their cars, so everybody knew exactly where the jurors came from and where they lived. When you originally pick a jury, you ask certain questions about the jurors. Where do you work? What kind of work does your husband do? Do you have a family? As you're trying to get into prejudice. That stuff is supposed to be kept away from the media. The judge specifically ordered that that stuff should be kept away from the media. In fact, what happened is that stuff was all over the media. What happened basically was then, starting in 1996, you had this drumbeat of money, this drumbeat of media attention. There were journalists on the Miami Herald, a relatively independent newspaper, well-known journalists, and these journalists were receiving, we have now detailed and documented, government monies to articulate a government position. And we have submitted to the court, and I have it here, and we can read it at some time if necessary, the kinds of language that was used by some of these reporters. Some of them talked about the fact that these particular 5 defendants were an advance team for a Castro invasion of southern Florida, because what was happening was the Cuban administration was falling apart, and this is something that Castro was going to do. So the jurors were let it be known that they were a vanguard of the defense of America from Castro and the people. What I'm saying sounds preposterous. What I'm saying sounds like fantasy. What I'm saying sounds incredible, that it would find its way into the newspapers and that it would find its way into courtrooms. But it's all there. And as I said, you can find this both in the court files and in those places that have the court files. We have detailed many of the articles that were used and many of the articles that were written. For example, Mike mentioned about the killing of tourists, an Italian tourist, back in 1997. There were about 40 journalists that were hired by the American government, some of them receiving as much as $406,000. And there were various stations, CBS, Univision, other stations, and newspapers that received substantial amounts of money also from the American government, also undisclosed. It's perfectly appropriate for America to send aside propaganda and to do it overseas. You can send through the Voice of America anything you want, whether it be directed at the Soviet Union. You can send across the seas anything you want, propaganda into Cuba. And that's what the function of Radio Marti was. What you cannot do is use American propaganda money to get at American citizens and to get at American jurors who were sitting on a trial. And that's exactly what was done. Radio Marti took its $37 million budget, they turned it towards southern Miami so that the jurors got on a daily basis 24 hours of daily reporting with the American government's view of this case. The amazing thing, of course, is that none of this was known to either the defense lawyers or the defendants. So they're sitting there in a trial, being prosecuted by the American government, and at the same time, unbeknownst to them, the American government is spending this extraordinary amount of money not only on the media, but on the undisclosed media, people who do not identify themselves. It's one thing if you say, I speak for the government, I'm a representative of the government. It's another thing when you say, I'm an individual, I have nothing to do with the government, and this is my particular view. The amount of information that came into this trial is pervasive and enormous. Radio Marti's tapes don't have to be disclosed for a 12-year period. The defendants and the defense lawyers knew nothing about it, did not know what was said, and for many years were unable to get that information. We have an application right now before the judge in an attempt to get that information, to add to all of the other printed stuff that we have. As I said, the case is extraordinarily detailed. I don't want to be duplicative of the kind of things Mike was saying. Some of the allegations, and I'll just talk also with respect to getting this information. The American government has databases with respect to monies paid and to who gets paid, and what you find in this particular period in Miami from 1996 to about 2001, the conviction is 2001, the databases can't be found, they've been deleted, and if you look after that, after 2000, 2002, you find that false names are given with respect to the kinds of people that receive funds. Nothing like this has ever been done in the American legal system. For all the enormous defects and horrors that have occurred in the past, there has been nothing like this case. The Supreme Court has never seen a case like it. The judge who was trying the case tried to some extent to deal with it, but she had no idea what was going on. She's now being confronted with this information for the first time. So she's being asked to say, this was going on, it's horrendous, I didn't know about it. But she has a commitment to upholding this conviction. And whether or not she upholds the conviction at this point, I don't know. Whether we ultimately go to the circuit court, I don't know. But this is a case that is a landmark of American injustice.